If you've never watched someone you love get murdered, I hope you never learn how it feels. I was 7 years old the day my world cracked apart, and it started with 3 sharp knocks on the front door. Fast, deliberate. It made the glass tremble in its frame. My father froze halfway through tying his bootlaces. For a moment, the whole kitchen seemed to hold its breath. He looked at me across the table, and there was something in his eyes I didn't have a name for yet. Something raw and scared. He didn't say my name. Just one word, low and shaking. Hide. The crawl space was behind the washing machine in the laundry room. He called it the safe place. I slipped past the machine, into the square hollow that smelled of old wood and damp concrete. The detergent box sat above me on a shelf, leaking its sweet, stinging scent into the air. I pressed my cheek to the cold wall and tried to breathe through my mouth. My heart thumped so hard I thought it might give me away. Through a narrow crack along the hinge, I could see a strip of tile, the edge of the kitchen doorway, and the faded hem of the curtain that never quite reached the floor. The door opened with a groan that scraped down my spine. A man stepped inside. His boots were black leather, polished bright as mirrors. I couldn't see his face, but when he spoke, his voice had a weight that filled up all the empty spaces in the room. It was calm in the way a thunderstorm is calm right before it breaks. "You always were a coward." My father's voice came back ragged. "That's rich, coming from you." The stranger moved another step forward. I could just make out the corner of a long coat shifting around his legs. "You thought you could take what was mine and vanish?" He sounded almost tired, like this was a conversation he'd had too many times already. My father's shoes shifted, scuffing the floor. "I did what I had to." "You cost me everything." A long silence. I held my breath, tasting the chemical sting of soap and something else, something sour that crawled up my throat. A shiver rattled down my spine and settled in my bones. "You don't have to do this," my father said finally, voice cracking in the middle. The man sighed. "You were never going to stop running." A sound I didn't recognize. A click, small but sharp. Then the dull, flat thunder of the gunshot. It didn't sound like the movies. It sounded final, like a door slamming shut forever. I bit my knuckles to keep from screaming as my father crashed backward into the counter. Something fell, glass breaking, and the smell of blood bloomed into the stale air. His legs buckled, and he sank out of sight behind the cabinets. I could only see a single hand, fingers twitching. Then nothing. The man stayed there, breathing hard. I could hear it, rough and uneven, filling the hush that had swallowed the kitchen whole. For a moment, I thought he might turn and look for me, but he only bent down, and I heard the faint scrape of his coat. A low voice I couldn't quite catch murmured something I would spend years trying to remember. Then the door creaked shut behind him, soft as a lullaby. I didn't know how long I stayed curled there, pressing myself into the wall until my skin hurt. Long enough for the afternoon sun to crawl across the floor and vanish. Long enough for the smell of blood to turn metallic, sour, heavy. When I finally crawled out, my legs were numb and my throat burned from holding back the scream. I stepped into the kitchen. His body lay crumpled near the fridge, eyes half open, mouth slack. My father, who had tucked me in every night and told me monsters couldn't cross our threshold. I thought I understood what I'd seen. I thought I knew who the monster was. I remember my mother coming for me when the dark finally settled over the house. She didn't ask what I'd seen. She just wrapped me in a blanket that smelled like wet wool and her sharp, flowery perfume, then lifted me into her arms. She carried me out the back door, into the cold, without saying a word. After that, Everything blurred. Endless highways, cheap motel rooms, her voice whispering that we had to keep moving, that it was the only way to stay safe. And for a long time, that was all I knew. The first year after we left didn't feel real. Every few months, we packed our bags before the sun came up. My mother moved through the rooms with quick, silent efficiency, as if she'd done it 100 times before. She never explained why we couldn't stay. When I asked if the man with the black boots would come looking for us, she would smooth my hair back and say, "Not if we keep moving." So we did. We stayed in old motels with threadbare blankets that smelled like damp carpet, in rented rooms where the walls were so thin you could hear the neighbours fighting. Each place blended into the next until they all felt the same. I learned how to fold my clothes so they fit into one suitcase, how to wake up quickly when the lights flicked on in the middle of the night, how to watch my mother's face in the rearview mirror for signs that we were about to leave again. Some nights, when she thought I was asleep, she sat at the edge of the bed with her head in her hands, breathing slowly like she was counting to 10. I didn't ask what she was thinking. I told myself it was better not to know. School was wherever we happened to be. I was always the new girl with the plastic lunchbox and the blank emergency contact form. I learned to keep my head down and my stories short. Most of the time, I never bothered unpacking all the way. When you grow up like that, you stop believing in the idea of home. A place is just somewhere you wait until it's time to leave. By the time I turned 10, I knew better than to get attached. I stopped learning my classmates' names, stopped hoping I could invite anyone over. I knew the questions would start eventually. Why we never stayed anywhere. Why my mother flinched when someone knocked on the door too loudly. Why I had nightmares so often. Whenever people asked, I would tell them my father died, and that was why we moved so much. It was only half a lie. We never went back to the town where he died. I asked my mother once if we could. Her face went so still, it looked like she'd turned to stone. Her voice was low and certain when she answered, "It's not safe. You can never go back there." That was all she said. I didn't ask again. When I was 12, we stayed longer than usual in a small house with cracked blue shutters and a fig tree out front. I made my first friend, a girl named Danica, who liked to braid my hair during recess. Sometimes I let myself believe we were done running, that maybe the worst was over. But late one night, I woke up to the sound of my mother zipping the suitcases. Her mouth was a hard, thin line when she turned to look at me. "Put your shoes on," she whispered. I didn't argue. By then, I understood the rules. As I got older, the memories blurred around the edges. Sometimes I thought about that day in the kitchen, about the man in the doorway, and the way my father's body fell. I told myself it didn't matter why he came. It only mattered that he did, and that he was the reason nothing ever felt safe again. I turned 16 in a town so small it didn't have a grocery store, only a gas station with a single dusty shelf of canned food. My mother bought me a cupcake and a cheap candle from the checkout counter. We sat on the motel bed with the plastic curtains drawn tight, and when she lit the candle, she smiled like she was trying to make it feel normal. I closed my eyes and wished for everything to stop moving. Sometimes I thought about the house with the crawl space and the life we left behind. But wishing didn't bring it back. Wishing didn't change anything. So I learned not to wish. I learned to wait. And I told myself that one day, somehow, I would stop feeling like a suitcase someone forgot to unpack. I moved out when I was 19. Not because I wanted to leave my mother, but because it felt like the only way to figure out who I was without her voice always in my ear. We'd been in the same town for almost a year by then, a dusty place with a main street that closed by 6 o'clock, where nobody asked too many questions. When I signed the lease on a tiny studio apartment above a pawn shop, my mother didn't try to stop me. She just looked at me for a long time and said, "Call me if you need anything." And for the first time in my life, I felt something close to free. The apartment smelled like old carpet and paint that never fully dried. I spent the first night lying on the floor with a single pillow, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of pipes in the walls. Even with the door locked and the blinds drawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, that any second a knock would shatter the quiet. I never stopped waiting for it. Most mornings, I woke before the sun, my heart racing, palms damp with sweat. I would see the same things in my dreams: my father's body falling out of view, the stranger's silhouette filling the doorway. Sometimes I could almost hear the gunshot again, feel it vibrating in my bones. Other times it was quiet, like the sound had been sucked out of the world. It didn't matter how many years passed. The memory stayed bright and sharp as broken glass. I worked 2 jobs to keep the rent paid. One at a diner that smelled like scorched coffee, the other stocking shelves in the back of a drugstore. I liked the hours, the exhaustion. It left less room in my head for everything else. At night, I would walk home with my keys clenched between my knuckles, scanning every car that passed. I told myself it was just a habit, that it didn't mean anything. But the truth was, no matter how far I got from that house, part of me was still there, hiding in the crawl space, waiting for the door to open. And the older I got, the more the questions hardened into something close to hate. Who was he? Why did he come? What could my father have done to make someone cross that threshold with a gun? I'd spent most of my life trying not to think about it. But one night, sitting on the floor with a stack of old newspaper clippings, I realized pretending wasn't enough anymore. It started small: a search on an old computer in the library, a newspaper archive that cost $2 an hour to use. I typed in every combination of words I could think of. Unsolved homicide. Father killed. Unknown suspect. At first there was nothing, just dead ends and faded headlines about other people's tragedies. Then, a name. It was buried in the middle of a short article, almost like it didn't belong there at all. Witnesses had seen a dark sedan parked near our street the week before the shooting, registered to a man named Ezekiel Nwosu. The paper said police questioned him, but there was no evidence linking him to the crime. It was the first time in years I'd felt something like certainty. I copied the name onto a piece of scrap paper in shaky block letters. Just seeing it in ink made my hands tremble. I spent weeks combing through whatever scraps of information I could find. Old court records, archived news articles, anything that mentioned Ezekiel's name. That's how I learned he had a son, Ayo Nwosu. His name was listed on a property deed. He was the only family Ezekiel had left. If I couldn't punish the father, I told myself, I would make the son carry the debt. So I found out where he lived, where he worked, and I started watching. The first time I saw Ayo in person, I was standing across the street from a coffee shop, pretending to look at a real estate flyer in the window. He was sitting by the front door, a paper cup cradled in both hands, his head tilted toward a woman I guessed was a co-worker. Even from a distance, he didn't look like someone who had grown up under the shadow of violence. He looked ordinary, safe. That made me hate him a little more. And it made me curious in a way I didn't expect. For weeks, I did nothing but watch. Every morning before work, he stopped at that same cafe. Every evening he left the construction site in the same white pickup truck. He was so predictable, it almost disappointed me. I spent nights sitting on the floor with a notebook open, scribbling lists I never showed anyone. His routines, the places he liked, the people he spoke to. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, just that when the moment came, I would have to be ready. Sometimes I would look at the newspaper clipping with his father's name and feel my pulse climb into my throat. This was the life that had kept me running. This was the family that had taken mine apart. And no matter how long it took, I was going to make them feel it. It started with small accidents. I found out where he liked to run in the mornings, a trail behind an old soccer field, and made sure I was there, stretching at the same time he arrived. I bumped into him near the farmer's market, pretending to fumble my phone so it skidded across the pavement. He picked it up, smiled politely, handed it back with a nod. His voice was deeper than I expected, soft around the edges. It made something in my chest twist in a way I didn't have a name for. I told myself it didn't matter. That whatever kindness he showed was just a layer over the same ugliness his father carried. I reminded myself every night why I was doing this, why I couldn't walk away. But when I lay down to sleep, I kept seeing his face behind my eyelids, and I hated that he felt more real to me than the man I'd spent my whole life hating. 3 months went by like that, me slipping in and out of places I knew he would be, studying the shape of his life from a safe distance. Then one morning, I chose a small corner table at the cafe he liked, made sure he could see me reading the same dog-eared book I always carried. When he walked in and spotted me, something in his face softened, like he'd been working up the courage. He set down his coffee, walked over slowly, and asked if I'd mind some company. He was shy about it, like he thought I might say no. I almost did. When he asked my name, I gave him one I'd practiced saying out loud, a name that belonged to no one at all. But then I pictured the crawl space, the red spreading across the tiles, the way my father's hand twitched before it went still. And I said yes. That first coffee was harder than I expected. He was so easy to talk to, so quick to laugh at my smallest jokes, that I felt the old story in my head start to fray around the edges. It was easier when he was just a headline, when he was just a target. But sitting across from him, watching the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, I felt something I hadn't planned on feeling. I felt sorry. We exchanged numbers that same morning, his thumb brushing mine as he typed it into my phone. I saved his contact under a name that wouldn't draw questions, but I couldn't bring myself to delete it later, even after I told myself I should. He started sending little messages, good mornings, did you make it home safes, photos of stray dogs he thought I'd find funny. I replied more often than I planned to. I told myself it was part of the act. But each reply felt like something real slipping through the cracks. Weeks passed, and we fell into a rhythm I didn't dare name. Coffee, before work, walks along the river after sunset, quiet dinners in dim restaurants where nobody knew either of us. Every time I looked at him, I tried to remember why I was there, why I couldn't let myself soften. But the lines kept blurring, until I couldn't tell whether I was pretending to care or pretending not to. The evening he invited me into his apartment was the first time I felt the story start to unravel. The rain tapped gently at the window, a slow rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. I remember the way his fingers brushed my cheek, the way he looked at me like he was certain I was something precious. When he kissed me, every thought I'd rehearsed, every plan I'd memorized, fell away, like a sheet pulled off a table. For the first time since I was a child, I felt the terrifying weight of wanting to be seen. Afterward, we lay tangled in the hush that follows everything you can't take back. His breath warmed the hollow of my throat, and his hand rested over my heart as if he could feel how hard it was trying to escape my ribs. I studied the ceiling and told myself it was just another step in the plan, just another way to make him trust me. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. I didn't feel like I was pretending anymore. After that day, I stopped needing to invent excuses to see him. He invited me out often. Movies, late dinners, lazy afternoons in bookstores that smelled like old paper and coffee grounds. I let him believe that we were two strangers drawn together by nothing more than luck. In reality, every moment was something I'd mapped out in advance, a path I'd been walking long before he knew my name. I tried to stay detached, to remind myself it was all a performance, that every time I laughed or touched his hand across the table, it was just part of the story I needed him to believe. But when he looked at me with that open, hopeful expression, I felt something crack in my chest. It scared me more than any nightmare ever had. Because if I let myself care, even a little, everything I'd built would come crashing down. One evening, as we walked along the river under a sky the color of bruised violets, he took my hand without asking. His palm was warm and sure. I let him hold it. And for one stolen moment, I let myself pretend we were just two people finding each other. No history, no ghosts, no debts waiting to be paid. But when I got home, I sat on the floor with the newspaper clipping in my lap and made myself read it again and again. I traced Ezekiel's name with my fingertip until the letters blurred into nothing. Then I folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Because no matter how much I wanted to forget, I knew why I was there. And I knew how the story had to end. I told myself I would know when the time was right, that I would feel something clear and decisive, like a hand on my shoulder pointing me toward the end. But the truth was, the moment crept up on me in pieces, small decisions that didn't feel dangerous until they were. Some days, I woke up in his bed and almost forgot why I was there. I'd watch him stir cream into my coffee, his eyes still soft with sleep, and feel something warm and stupid trying to take root in my chest. Other days, I couldn't look at him without tasting the old anger on my tongue, bitter and impossible to swallow. That was when I knew I had to act, because if I waited any longer, I wouldn't be able to. I built the ending the same way I'd built the beginning, carefully, deliberately, one detail at a time. A small vial wrapped in an old scarf at the bottom of my purse. A quiet story about herbal supplements he'd never heard of. A quiet reassurance in the dark that everything was fine. The first time I slipped the powder into his coffee, my hands didn't even shake. That morning, he'd answered a call while I was in the kitchen. I couldn't hear every word, but I knew it was Ezekiel, his voice lighter, younger, warmed by the easy affection that passed between them. I stood there listening to him laugh with the man who had stolen everything from me, and something in my chest went hot and wild. I knew in that moment I would never have a conversation like that with my father. I would never get back what he took. By the time I carried the mug to the table, the choice was already made. I watched the swirl of cream bloom through the cup, pale and harmless. He thanked me when I handed it over, smiling like I was something soft in a world that had never been kind to him. I smiled back. Inside, something splintered. It wasn't the kind of poison that worked quickly. I'd read about it in the library, in an old medical journal with yellowed pages. It mimicked the symptoms of a slow illness: fatigue, nausea, a gradual hollowing out of the body that no one could trace back to me. I told myself that was kinder, that I wasn't a monster if I didn't make him suffer all at once. But in the middle of the night, when I lay awake beside him, listening to the rough edge in his breathing, I wasn't so sure. He tried to pretend he wasn't sick, tried to work the same long hours and take me on the same quiet walks. But within weeks, the colour had drained from his face, and his hands trembled when he reached for mine. He would smile like it was a game he could win if he just wanted it badly enough. But there were nights when he woke coughing, his skin hot with fever, and I would hold a damp cloth to his forehead, feeling the betrayal in every careful touch. When it became clear he couldn't keep up alone, he asked me to stay. I told myself it was only until he got better. I thought the guilt would get easier, that if I repeated the story in my head often enough, it would cover the cracks. But instead, it grew louder, until it was a second heartbeat pulsing under my skin. Sometimes he would look at me with that soft, searching expression, and I would feel like I was the one being hunted, like he could see straight through to the part of me that still wanted to believe I deserved love. The last night was the quietest of all. He was too weak to sit up, his breath thin and uneven. I sat beside him in the dark, counting the seconds between each shallow inhale. I thought about all the ways this could have ended differently if I'd left him alone, if I'd let myself believe in something other than vengeance. But by then, it was too late to turn back. I had already decided who I was going to be. When the morning came, he didn't wake up. The sunlight spilled across the sheets in a thin, pale ribbon, touching the side of his face I couldn't bear to look at. I sat there for a long time, watching the rise and fall of my own breathing, trying to feel something righteous, something clean. But all I felt was hollow. I called the ambulance with a voice I didn't recognize. I told them it must have been some kind of sudden illness. They asked if he'd had any symptoms. I lied as easily as I'd ever told the truth. After they took him away, I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed my palms into my eyes until the dark behind them felt safer than the light. In the weeks after the funeral, I moved through the world like a ghost. His friends called to offer condolences, their voices full of gentle confusion. I thanked them in the tone you use when you're trying not to let anything slip through the cracks. His father never called. I wondered if he knew, if some instinct had told him what I'd done. Part of me wished he would come looking for me, because at least then, the emptiness might feel like something earned. I told myself this was justice, that I had evened the scale. But every night when I closed my eyes, I didn't see the crawl space or the kitchen floor anymore. I saw Ayo's face the last time he looked at me, when he was too weak to speak, but still trying to tell me something with his eyes. I never figured out what it was. And in the quiet that followed, I started to wonder if I ever would. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't feel the way you expect. It isn't clean. It seeps in around the edges of your days, turns everything a shade duller, a little heavier. For weeks after Ayo died, I told myself I was mourning the life I never let myself have, that it was guilt and nothing more. But the truth was, something deeper had taken root, a suspicion I couldn't name yet, but that I felt every time I tried to look in the mirror without flinching. I packed my things in the same careful way I always had. Neat rows of folded clothes, boxes labelled in my small, precise handwriting. I told the landlord I wouldn't be renewing the lease. When he asked why, I just said I needed to be somewhere else, someplace quieter. He nodded without pressing, and I wondered if he saw the same exhaustion in my face that I saw in everyone who had ever tried to outlive a tragedy. It was early evening when the letter came. A thin envelope slipped under my door, the paper cheap and rough under my fingertips. There was no return address. Just my name, written in a slanting hand that looked almost familiar. I sat at the table for a long time before I opened it, listening to the tick of the old clock on the wall. When I finally unfolded the single sheet inside, my breath stalled in my chest. I don't remember the exact words, only that they started like this. You don't know me, but I knew your mother. I know your father too, both of them. I read it twice before the meaning settled. Then I read it a third time, as if repetition would make it less impossible. The letter went on to describe things no stranger could have known. The crawl space behind the washing machine, the smell of bleach in the kitchen, the way my mother used to hum when she thought no one could hear. Your real father was named Ezekiel Nwosu, it said. He and your mother were married before you were born. She died giving birth to you. When you were just a few months old, Ezekiel was arrested on charges he didn't commit. The man you grew up calling your father was supposed to take you to stay with relatives while Ezekiel was in custody. Instead, he took you and disappeared before anyone could stop him. My hands shook so badly the paper rattled. I pressed it flat against my thigh and tried to breathe. My pulse was loud in my ears, a dull roar that drowned out everything else. I wanted to tear the letter into pieces, but I kept reading. The day you watched that man die, Ezekiel wasn't coming to hurt you. He was trying to bring you home. He spent years searching for you after that. He never stopped. I closed my eyes and saw the kitchen again. But this time, the memory split into something unrecognizable. The voice I'd hated for so long was saying something different now, something I'd never let myself hear. You cost me everything. Not a threat, a grief. I don't know how long I sat there. The light faded until the room was dark, the letter a pale shape in my hands. Part of me hoped I would wake up and find it was a dream, that I could go back to believing the version of my life I'd carried like a shield. But when I opened my eyes, nothing had changed. I was still sitting alone, and the truth was still there, plain as daylight. The last paragraph was the one that broke me. Ayo didn't know any of this. He thought you were just someone he was lucky to love. I'm sorry you had to learn it this way. I thought you deserved to know. The realization came all at once, like ice water poured down my spine. Ayo wasn't just the son of the man I thought I hated. He was my brother. Not by my mother, but by the blood we shared in Ezekiel. I had loved him, touched him, killed him, and all the while I had been spilling my own blood without even knowing it. I pressed my hand to my chest, half convinced my heart would stop from the shame. It should have. I pressed the heel of my hand against my mouth to keep the sound inside, but it was no use. A sob tore free, raw and unfamiliar. It felt like something dying in my chest. I stayed up all night, reading the letter over and over until the words blurred. I thought about Ayo's hands on my skin, the way he'd looked at me like I was something good. I thought about the last breath he ever took, and I thought about all the years I'd spent building a revenge I didn't understand. I had become the monster I'd been chasing. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. I folded the letter carefully, like it was something sacred, and slipped it into my bag. Then I picked up the phone and dialed the number I had found listed under Ezekiel's name, a number I had never called before. When the line connected, I heard a man's voice on the other end, older and hoarse with sleep. Hello? I swallowed hard. My name is... But the rest caught in my throat. It was the first time I realized I didn't know who I was anymore. Guilt doesn't feel like a knife. It feels like water rising past your mouth, past your eyes, until you're drowning in something you can't name. In the weeks after the letter, I lived underwater. Every sound was muffled, every color drained pale. People spoke to me and I nodded without hearing a word. I moved through the days as if I were wearing someone else's skin. Sometimes I thought I could feel Ayo's hand still resting over my heart, warm and forgiving in a way I didn't deserve. I stopped answering my phone, stopped checking the mail. I left the apartment only when I had no choice. The world outside felt thinner somehow, like if I breathed too hard, it would split open and swallow me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same moment. His face in the last light of morning, his lips parting to say something he didn't have time to finish. I wondered if he knew, if he felt the truth before it reached me. One night, I dreamed of my mother. Not the woman I'd followed from town to town, but the real one. Her hair dark around her shoulders, her hands resting on the swell of her stomach. I'd never seen her in life, but in the dream, she was smiling, and when she looked at me, there was something in her eyes that made my throat close. She reached for me, and I woke up with tears drying on my cheeks, my chest hollowed out by a loss I couldn't remember. I told myself it would be easier if I left, that the apartment was a coffin holding everything I'd done. So I packed the boxes the same way I always had. Folded shirts, taped seams, labels in neat handwriting. But when it came time to close the last one, my hands went still. Because buried under a stack of old receipts was the folded newspaper clipping with Ezekiel's name. I picked it up like it might burn me, and for the first time, I let myself whisper what I had never said aloud. I'm sorry. The words felt small in my mouth, too late and too thin, but once I started, I couldn't stop. I said it again and again, until my voice broke, until I felt like maybe the house could hear me, until I almost believed someone was listening. I didn't know where else to go. So I drove back to the place I'd been running from my whole life. The town hadn't changed much. The same cracked sidewalks, the same brick storefronts gone soft with age. I parked on the corner and watched the sky fade into evening, wondering if any part of it would feel familiar. But standing there, I felt like a stranger in a life I'd only imagined. The house was still there, smaller than I remembered, sagging a little at the eaves. Someone had painted the door a dull blue that didn't suit it, but the shape was the same. The windows were dark, the yard overgrown with weeds. I climbed the front steps slowly, half expecting the door to swing open and my father, no, the man I'd called my father, to fill the frame. But there was nothing, just quiet. I walked around the side, gravel crunching under my shoes. The crawl space was still there behind the washing machine vent, just a square of plywood nailed over the place where I'd hidden. I knelt and pressed my palm to it, feeling the rough grain under my skin. So much of my life had been born in that dark little box. Hatred, fear, a promise I thought would save me. Instead, it had turned me into the very thing I was so sure I'd never become. When I stood up, the sky was almost black. A thin moon hung over the rooftops, pale and indifferent. I looked back at the house one last time, and for the first time since I was 7, I felt nothing at all. No grief, no longing, just the quiet certainty that the past was over, and whatever came next would be something I deserved. I drove away before I could change my mind, back to the empty apartment, the packed boxes, the letter folded neatly on the kitchen table. I picked up the phone and stared at it until my vision blurred. Then I dialed the number for the local police station. When the dispatcher answered, my voice didn't even tremble. "I need to make a statement," I said. "My name is..." And this time, I didn't stop. They took me into a small interview room with walls the color of old paper. There was a single chair, a table scarred with knife marks, and a camera in the corner blinking its steady red eye. The detective introduced herself in a calm, measured voice, but I couldn't remember her name. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for the questions to start. But she only pressed the button on the recorder and said, "Whenever you're ready." My throat felt raw, like I'd been screaming. But when I spoke, my voice came out steady. "My name is Adaora Nwosu," I began. It was the first time I'd said it aloud, the name that was always supposed to be mine. For a moment, it felt like stepping into someone else's life, someone braver, someone who hadn't lost everything she ever loved to a lie. I told her everything, how I watched the man I thought was my father die on the kitchen floor, believing he was the only good thing I had left. How my mother packed us up in the dark and vanished, weaving a story so tight I never thought to pull at the threads. How I spent 20 years sharpening my grief into something that felt like purpose. How I found Ayo. How I made him love me. How I watched him fade a little more every day and told myself it was justice. I told them about the letter, how it arrived folded into a plain envelope with no return address. How I sat on my kitchen table reading the words over and over until they blurred into nothing. How it said Ezekiel was my real father and Ayo was my brother. But I left out the part about Ezekiel killing the man who raised me. I don't know if it was kindness or cowardice, maybe both. I just wanted to give him the chance to keep believing there was something worth saving in his own story. She didn't interrupt. Her pen moved over the form in slow, even strokes. But I could feel the shape of her thoughts in the space between us. I knew what she was thinking, that I was broken in some way she couldn't fix, that maybe I had always been. When I reached the part about the letter, my voice wavered. I tried to keep it steady as I explained what it said, who I really was, who Ayo really was. Even saying the words out loud felt like tearing something open that would never heal again. When I finally stopped talking, she sat there for a long time without writing anything down. Her eyes weren't sharp anymore. They were just tired, the way a person looks when they realize there's no simple way to set things right. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, like she was afraid of breaking whatever was left of me. I didn't come here to be forgiven, I said quietly. I needed her to hear that. I just wanted someone to know the story, all of it, because if I'm going to carry it, I don't want to carry it alone. Silence fell between us like dust. The detective reached for the recorder and switched it off. In the quiet that followed, I felt something shift in my chest. Some weight I'd been holding for so long, I almost couldn't remember life without it. It didn't lift exactly, but it settled, like it finally understood it had nowhere else to go. They booked me into a holding cell with cinder-block walls and a single narrow window. The air smelled of bleach and stale air, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running. I lay down on the thin mattress and closed my eyes. I thought about my mother, my real mother, and the life I never had. About Ayo's laugh, low and surprised when he thought I was funny. About the man I spent 20 years hating, who only ever wanted to bring me home. I thought about all the ways a story can turn into a cage, how love can become a weapon, how grief can make monsters of us all. And when I opened my eyes, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like the architect of my own ruin. And somehow, that was worse. Let me remind you, hate feels safer than grief. It gives you something sharp to hold when everything else has slipped through your hands. I know, because I built my entire life around it. I told myself revenge would set me free. That if I made someone else pay, I'd finally stop feeling like a scared little girl hiding in the dark. But all it did was turn me into the thing I hated. I spent years believing I was chasing justice, when I was really running from the truth. I killed my own brother and didn't know it until his body was already cold. And now I have to live with the fact that my real father didn't just lose his first child. He lost both of us. Don't make the mistake I did. Don't let vengeance blind you to what's real. Because when the lie finally breaks, it will take everything good inside you with it. And you'll be left alone, staring at the pieces of a life you never really understood. Remember this: you can spend your whole life trying to punish someone for your pain, but all you'll end up doing is proving how much of you was already broken.